One of the first things that happens when a female empath is deeply hurt is something that most people completely misinterpret. They assume she's giving up. They assume she's defeated. They assume she's become cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. But what they're actually witnessing is something far more significant. There's watching a person stop participating in a game she never wanted to play in the first place. For years, many female empaths operate from a place of explanation. They explain their intentions. They explain their feelings. They explain why something hurt them. They explain why they continue to care. They explain why they keep giving chances. They explain themselves because they genuinely believe understanding creates connection. From their perspective, if someone could just understand what they're feeling, the conflict could be resolved. If someone could just see the situation through their eyes, healing could begin. This belief comes from empathy itself. An empath naturally assumes that understanding leads to compassion, because that's exactly how her own mind works. The problem is that not everyone operates this way. Some people understand perfectly and still choose their own interests. Some people hear the explanation but have no intention of changing. Some people collect explanations not to improve the relationship, but to gain more information about what affects the empath emotionally. This is where the female empath experiences one of the most painful lessons of her life. She discovers that communication is not the same thing as comprehension, and comprehension is not the same thing as caring. That realization changes everything. Psychologically speaking, many empaths fall into what researchers often describe as overfunctioning. When a relationship becomes strained, they don't pull back. They move closer. They invest more effort. They increase communication. They become more patient. They offer more understanding. They assume the problem can be solved through greater emotional labor. But eventually, a threshold is crossed. Eventually, there comes a moment when the empath recognizes a pattern. Not a single incident. Not a misunderstanding. A pattern. She begins noticing that every conflict requires her to explain herself. Every disagreement requires her to defend her feelings. Every boundary requires a lengthy justification. Every emotional wound becomes a courtroom where she must present evidence proving that her experience is valid. And at some point, she asks a life-changing question. Why am I constantly explaining things that should be obvious to someone who claims to care about me? That question is where the transformation begins. The shift is subtle at first. She stops arguing. She stops defending. She stops sending long messages, trying to make someone understand. She stops repeating the same emotional truths over and over again. To outsiders, this can look like withdrawal. In reality, it is clarity, because she finally understands something powerful. Genuine relationships do not require endless explanations. Healthy people may occasionally misunderstand each other, but they don't require constant persuasion to acknowledge another person's reality. This is where many people become shocked. They were accustomed to the empath chasing resolution. They were accustomed to her initiating difficult conversations. They were accustomed to her attempting to repair every fracture. And suddenly that effort disappears. Not because she stopped caring, because she stopped carrying responsibilities that were never hers. There's an important philosophical principle hidden inside this transformation. A person's willingness to explain themselves often reflects their hope for connection. But endless self-explanation can also become a form of self-abandonment. When someone continuously feels obligated to justify their emotions, they begin treating their own experiences as if they require external approval before they become legitimate. The hurt female empath eventually rejects that idea. She realizes her pain is real, whether someone validates it or not. Her boundaries are valid, whether someone agrees with them or not. Her experiences matter, whether someone understands them or not. That realization creates a kind of inner authority. And inner authority changes how a person moves through the world. The female empath who once spent hours trying to be understood begins spending that time understanding herself. The energy once invested in convincing others gets redirected inward. She becomes more observant, more selective, more intentional. She starts noticing who listens and who merely waits for their turn to speak, who respects boundaries and who negotiates against them, who values her presence and who simply values her availability. For the first time, She sees people clearly. And perhaps the most surprising part is that her silence often reveals more than her words ever did. When she stops explaining herself, people are forced to confront their own assumptions. When she stops chasing understanding, others suddenly notice the absence of the effort they once took for granted. When she stops proving her worth, those who overlooked it begin to recognize what they lost. This is not manipulation, it is consequence. And consequences are powerful teachers. The female empath's silence is not weakness. It is the moment she realizes that her value does not increase every time she argues for it. Her worth was never hidden. The wrong people simply refuse to see it. The day she stops explaining herself is the day she stops asking for permission to exist as she truly is. And that is when her real transformation begins. Because the strongest person in the room is often the one who no longer feels compelled to convince anyone of what they already know to be true. After a female empath stops explaining herself, something even more surprising begins to happen. The people around her start noticing a change they never expected. The emotional access they once had to her begins to disappear. Now, when I say emotional access, I'm talking about something deeper than communication. I'm talking about entry into a person's inner world, access to their compassion, access to their patience, access to their understanding, access to the emotional safety they provide for everyone around them. Most people never think about emotional access because they assume it will always be there. That's one of the reasons the female empath is often taken for granted. Her presence feels permanent. She's the person who listens when nobody else will. She's the one who notices subtle changes in mood. She's the one who remembers conversations, remembers pain, remembers struggles. She's often carrying emotional information about the people around her that even those people have forgotten themselves. Over time, others become accustomed to this. Not because they're malicious, because human beings adapt to what is consistently available. Psychologists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as habituation. The more consistently something is present, the less consciously we notice it. What was once appreciated becomes expected. What was once valued becomes assumed. And few people experience this more intensely than empaths. The empath's emotional generosity becomes part of the environment. People stop seeing it as a gift and start seeing it as a feature of reality. They assume she'll understand. They assume she'll forgive. They assume she'll be available. They assume she'll stay. And that assumption creates a dangerous imbalance. Because while everyone is drawing emotional support from the empath, very few stop to ask what it costs her to provide it. Every conversation requires energy. Every emotional burden absorbed requires processing. Every act of understanding requires attention. Empathy is powerful, but it is not free. It has a psychological cost. The problem is that many female empaths become so skilled at carrying emotional weight that nobody notices how heavy the load has become, including the empath herself. For years, she may convince herself that being needed is the same thing as being valued, that if people rely on her, they must appreciate her, that if she continues giving, eventually the relationship will become balanced. But eventually reality interrupts that belief. She starts noticing a pattern. The same people who expect understanding rarely offer it. The same people who seek support disappear when she needs support. The same people who demand access to her emotions become uncomfortable when she expresses her own. This realization is deeply painful because it forces her to confront a difficult truth. Some relationships survive not because of mutual connection, but because of one person's willingness to carry most of the emotional responsibility. Once she sees that, she cannot unsee it. And that's when the withdrawal begins. Not dramatic withdrawal, not revenge, not punishment, discernment. This is an important distinction. A healthy empath does not stop caring about people. She simply becomes more careful about who receives her emotional investment. She begins asking questions she never asked before. Who consistently respects my boundaries? Who reciprocates effort? Who values me beyond what I provide? Who shows up when there is nothing to gain? These questions act like a filter, and many relationships fail that filter. What shocks people is not her anger, it's her absence. Because for the first time, she stops volunteering her emotional resources to individuals who have repeatedly depleted them. The person who once answered every call now takes her time. The person who once rushed to solve everyone's problems now allows others to solve their own. The person who once felt responsible for everyone's emotional well-being finally recognizes a revolutionary idea. Other adults are responsible for themselves. That sounds obvious, but for many empaths, it is one of the hardest lessons they will ever learn. They've spent years believing love means carrying, believing kindness means sacrificing, believing compassion means enduring. But mature empathy understands something different. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Support without limits becomes exploitation. Understanding without reciprocity becomes imbalance. The hurt female empath begins to recognize that protecting her emotional energy is not selfish. It's necessary. Think about it this way. Every human being possesses finite psychological resources. Time is limited. Attention is limited. Energy is limited. If you continually invest those resources into relationships that drain you, you inevitably reduce your ability to invest in relationships that nourish you. This is not merely a relationship issue. It's an identity issue. Because every yes given to the wrong people often becomes a no given to yourself. The female empath eventually reaches a point where she understands this deeply. She understands that access to her heart is not an entitlement. It is a privilege. And privileges are earned through trust, respect, consistency, and mutual care. This is where her behavior becomes shocking to those who knew the previous version of her. The old version felt obligated. The new version feels intentional. The old version feared disappointing people. The new version fears abandoning herself. The old version gave access automatically. The new version grants access selectively. And ironically, this is the healthiest version of empathy. Because true empathy was never meant to make someone endlessly available. It was meant to help them connect wisely. The female empath's greatest transformation occurs when she realizes that boundaries do not block love. They protect it. They ensure that her compassion reaches places where it can grow rather than places where it will be consumed. And once she learns that lesson, everything changes. Because the moment you stop giving your heart to everyone is often the moment you finally discover who truly deserves it. And the people who value your presence will never require unlimited access to prove your love. Once a hurt female empath stops explaining herself and begins protecting access to her emotional world, something remarkable happens. The energy that was once flowing outward starts flowing inward. And this is where the transformation becomes truly unexpected. Most people assume pain weakens a person, at least temporarily. They expect heartbreak to create paralysis. They expect disappointment to create bitterness. They expect emotional wounds to leave someone smaller than they were before. Sometimes that happens, but in other cases, pain becomes a catalyst. And when that happens in the life of a female empath, the results often surprise everyone around her. One of the reasons this transformation is so powerful is because empaths tend to invest enormous amounts of energy into other people. They analyze relationships. They support friends. They carry emotional burdens. They attempt to solve problems that don't belong to them. They spend years trying to heal wounds that were never theirs to heal. What few people realize is that all of that effort requires tremendous psychological resources, focus, attention, creativity, emotional endurance. The very qualities that allow an empath to help others are the same qualities that can create extraordinary personal growth when redirected inward. The turning point usually begins with a difficult realization. She starts recognizing that no amount of sacrifice can force another person to change. No amount of understanding can create accountability in someone who refuses responsibility. No amount of love can heal a person who has chosen not to heal themselves. This realization can be painful because it challenges one of the empath's deepest assumptions, that if she just tries hard enough, cares deeply enough, or gives enough of herself, she can create a different outcome. But when that belief finally breaks, something valuable emerges. Freedom. For the first time, she stops asking, "How do I fix them?" and begins asking, "How do I strengthen myself?" That single shift changes the direction of her entire life. Psychologically speaking, this is a movement from external focus to internal development. Instead of monitoring another person's behavior, she begins observing her own patterns. Instead of studying someone else's wounds, she begins healing her own. Instead of investing in potential, she begins investing in reality. This process is rarely dramatic. In fact, it's often invisible. The outside world sees silence. The empath experiences reconstruction. She starts reading more, learning more, reflecting more. She develops skills she once postponed, pursues interests she once neglected, builds habits that support her future rather than relationships that drain her present. And this is where many people become confused, because they expected her to collapse. Instead, she evolves. There's an important principle in psychology known as post-traumatic growth. The concept suggests that some individuals don't merely recover from adversity. They develop because of it. Not because suffering is inherently good. Not because pain is desirable. But because hardship forces questions that comfort never asks. Pain has a way of exposing weaknesses in our thinking. It reveals unhealthy attachments. It uncovers dependencies. It forces us to examine beliefs we previously accepted without question. For the female empath, one of those beliefs is often the idea that her worth comes from what she gives. For years, she may have measured her value through service, support, understanding, and sacrifice. Then life presents a difficult challenge. What happens when all of that giving is not appreciated? What happens when generosity is exploited? What happens when loyalty is ignored? The answer becomes the foundation of her growth. She learns that value is not created through endless sacrifice. Value exists before sacrifice ever begins. This changes her relationship with herself. Instead of seeking validation through usefulness, she begins developing self-respect through self-awareness. And self-awareness is powerful, because once a person understands themselves clearly, manipulation becomes far less effective. The female empath begins recognizing patterns she previously missed. She notices red flags earlier. She trusts her intuition more confidently. She stops confusing potential with character. She stops mistaking attention for commitment. She stops interpreting emotional intensity as genuine connection. These lessons are expensive. They are paid for with disappointment. But they become assets that serve her for the rest of her life. Philosophically, this transformation reflects one of the oldest truths about human growth. A person cannot become who they are capable of being while remaining attached to who they used to be. Growth requires release. Not only releasing people, releasing old beliefs, old habits, old identities, old versions of yourself. The hurt female empath eventually understands that healing is not about returning to who she was before the pain. It's about becoming someone wiser because of it. That distinction matters, because many people spend years trying to recover a previous version of themselves. The empath who truly transforms aims for something higher. She doesn't seek restoration. She seeks evolution. And this is why her progress often shocks those who underestimated her. They remember the woman who doubted herself, the woman who overextended herself, the woman who accepted less than she deserved. They expect to find that same person waiting where they left her. Instead, they encounter someone entirely different, someone calmer, someone stronger, someone more selective, someone who has learned that peace is more valuable than approval. And perhaps most importantly, someone who has discovered that her greatest responsibility was never fixing others. It was developing herself, because the most powerful response to being hurt is not revenge. It is growth so profound that the pain which once threatened to break you becomes the very thing that built you. And when you transform your suffering into strength, you achieve something extraordinary. You turn your deepest wound into the foundation of your greatest future. As this transformation continues, the female empath reaches a stage that often creates the greatest confusion for the people around her. They begin saying things like, "You've changed." And for once, they're absolutely right, but not in the way they think. When most people hear the phrase, "You've changed," it's usually presented as a criticism. It's an attempt to suggest that someone has become less kind, less caring, less generous, or less approachable. Yet in many cases, what people are actually reacting to is not a loss of kindness. They're reacting to the appearance of self-respect. And those two things are often mistaken for each other. For years, many female empaths build their identities around being available, understanding, forgiving, and accommodating. These qualities become so deeply woven into their sense of self that they begin measuring their worth by how much they can endure. The more they tolerate, the more loving they believe they are. The more they sacrifice, the more valuable they feel. The more discomfort they absorb, the more they convince themselves they're doing the right thing. At first glance, this may look noble. In some situations, it is. Patience has value. Compassion has value. Forgiveness has value. But every virtue becomes destructive when separated from wisdom. Patience without limits becomes permission. Compassion without discernment becomes vulnerability to exploitation. Forgiveness without accountability becomes an invitation for repetition. The hurt female empath eventually learns this lesson through experience rather than theory. She discovers that some people do not respect kindness. They consume it. Some people do not appreciate understanding. They expect it. Some people do not honor forgiveness. They rely on it. And once she recognizes these patterns, something fundamental shifts inside her. She begins viewing herself differently. This is important because behavior follows identity. When someone sees themselves as responsible for everyone else's happiness, they behave one way. When they see themselves as equally worthy of care and protection, they behave another way entirely. The female empath starts asking questions she may have avoided for years. Why do I feel guilty for having boundaries? Why am I comfortable disappointing myself, but terrified of disappointing others? Why do I keep extending grace to people who would never extend the same grace to me? These questions are uncomfortable because they force honest reflection, and honest reflection often reveals an inconvenient truth. Many empaths are not only giving love, they're seeking acceptance. They're hoping that enough sacrifice will earn security, enough understanding will earn loyalty, enough patience will earn respect. But genuine respect rarely emerges from self-sacrifice alone. In fact, the opposite is often true. People tend to respect what is protected, what has standards, what has boundaries, what has conditions for access. The female empath eventually realizes that teaching others how to treat her is not selfish. It's necessary. And this realization changes her behavior in ways that surprise everyone around her. She starts saying no without writing a 5-page explanation. She stops apologizing for needs that are entirely reasonable. She stops negotiating boundaries that should never have been debated. She becomes comfortable with discomfort. The discomfort that comes from disappointing people who benefited from her lack of limits. This is one of the most misunderstood phases of personal growth. When someone develops self-respect, certain relationships become strained. Not because the person became difficult, because the relationship was built on unequal expectations. The people who genuinely care about her adapt. The people who relied on unrestricted access often resist. This resistance can be confusing. It can make the empath question herself. She may wonder whether she's becoming selfish, whether she's becoming cold, whether she's losing the very qualities that once defined her. But if we look closely, we see something entirely different happening. She is not becoming less compassionate. She is becoming more balanced. She is not becoming less loving. She is becoming more selective. She is not abandoning empathy. She is finally extending empathy to herself. And for many female empaths, that may be the hardest lesson of all. Offering compassion to others feels natural. Offering it to themselves feels uncomfortable. Yet true emotional maturity requires both. Imagine trying to fill every cup in the room while ignoring your own. Eventually, there is nothing left to give. This is why self-respect becomes such a powerful turning point. It transforms kindness from a reflex into a choice. It transforms generosity from obligation into intention. It transforms relationships from dependency into mutuality. Philosophically, self-respect represents a declaration. It is the moment a person decides that their well-being matters too, not more than everyone else, but not less, either. That balance is where healthy relationships begin. And once the female empath reaches this point, people often describe her as unrecognizable, Not because she has changed her values, because she has finally aligned her behavior with them. She still cares deeply, still loves deeply, still understands deeply. But now those qualities operate alongside standards, rather than in place of them. The woman who once accepted treatment she knew was wrong no longer does. The woman who once tolerated disrespect to avoid conflict no longer does. The woman who once abandoned herself to preserve relationships no longer does. And that version of her is far more powerful than the one who endlessly sacrificed. Because self-respect creates a kind of quiet strength that cannot be manipulated, negotiated, or taken away. The moment you stop treating your own value as optional is the moment the world begins to see it as undeniable. And the people who truly belong in your life will never require you to betray yourself in order to keep them there. By the time a hurt female empath reaches this final stage, the transformation is nearly complete. She has stopped explaining herself. She has withdrawn unrestricted access to her emotional world. She has redirected her energy toward growth. She has developed a level of self-respect that reshapes every relationship in her life. And then something happens that most people never expect. She lets go. Not temporarily, not symbolically, not as a strategy. She genuinely moves forward. This is the moment that shocks everyone, because many people assume the empath will always remain emotionally connected to the past. They assume she will continue revisiting old conversations, replaying old memories, analyzing old wounds, and waiting for the closure that never arrived. After all, empaths feel deeply. They remember deeply. They process experiences with extraordinary emotional detail. So people naturally expect that once hurt, the empath will remain attached to the pain indefinitely. But that's not what ultimately happens. In fact, the deepest healing often produces the opposite result. The female empath eventually realizes something profound. She does not need the past to change in order for her future to begin. Think about how much of human suffering is connected to unfinished stories. People wait for apologies. They wait for recognition. They wait for accountability. They wait for someone to finally understand the damage they caused. And while those things can certainly help, they often become emotional traps. Because when your healing depends on another person's actions, your peace remains under their control. The hurt female empath eventually recognizes this. She sees that every day spent waiting for someone else to provide closure is another day she postpones her own freedom. This realization changes everything. Psychologically, there is an important distinction between remembering and remaining attached. Remembering is natural. Attachment is optional. The empath may never forget what happened. She may never erase the lessons. She may never completely lose the memories. But she stops building her identity around them. And that is where true recovery begins. Many people mistakenly believe healing means forgetting. It doesn't. Healing means remembering without reliving. It means thinking about the experience without being emotionally pulled back into it. It means carrying the wisdom while releasing the weight. This process is especially powerful for female empaths because they often spend years trying to understand why people did what they did, why someone lied, why someone betrayed them, why someone failed to appreciate their loyalty, why someone chose selfishness over connection. The empath's mind searches for answers because understanding has always been one of her strengths. But eventually she discovers a truth that changes her perspective. Not every question receives an answer, and not every answer creates peace. Sometimes the pursuit of explanation becomes another form of attachment. The need to know why can keep a person emotionally connected long after the relationship itself has ended. The female empath eventually reaches a point where she no longer needs every mystery solved. She no longer needs every wrong acknowledged. She no longer needs every chapter rewritten. Instead, she focuses on what she can control: her choices, her growth, her future. This shift may sound simple, but it is incredibly powerful. Because attention is one of the most valuable resources a human being possesses. Where attention goes, energy follows. Where energy goes, life develops. For years, the empath may have invested enormous amounts of attention into people who damaged her. Now she redirects that attention toward building something better, toward her goals, her health, her purpose, her peace. And this is where the surprise becomes visible to everyone else. The people who expected her to remain emotionally available discover she has moved on. The people who assumed they could return whenever they wanted discover that access is no longer automatic. The people who believed she would always be waiting discover she isn't waiting at all. Not because she hates them, not because she's seeking revenge, because she has finally accepted reality. One of the most mature psychological skills a person can develop is the ability to release what no longer serves their growth. Not deny it, not suppress it, release it. There's a philosophical principle that appears across countless traditions and schools of thought. Holding on to the past does not preserve it. It only prolongs its influence. The female empath eventually understands that carrying an old wound does not honor the lesson. Living differently because of the lesson honors it. That distinction changes her life. She stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and starts asking, "What can this teach me?" She stops measuring her future by her past disappointments. She starts measuring it by he